It's time to start our international session, The Role of Scientific Community in Disaster Response, Lessons Learned from the COVID-19 Pandemic. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, bonjour, konnichiwa, everybody in the world. I am Miyoko Watanabe, a facilitator of this session. Thank you very much for coming to this session. We invite speakers from 7 countries in this session today, so I expect we can have discussion from global perspective. First of all, I would like to introduce the purpose and background of this session. We have the COVID-19 pandemic now in the world, and our societies are in the chaotic mess, almost. The number of the infected people has settled down for a while once, but it is increasing now again. The COVID-19 continues to be a major threat in the world. Science has contributed so much to this threat by providing scientific evidence. But we have questions. How have scientists been involved actually? Was it enough? An interview with Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of medical journal The Lancet, showed some important points, raising an early issue regarding a pandemic response. One issue he pointed out is international collaborations. This pandemic is a common issue in the world, so that we can solve this problem with international collaborations. We need data sharing or open science at the world level. The other point he said is we cannot rely only on vaccine. The vaccine has been reported to be very popular very soon in the United States. But vaccine cannot be a magic bullet soon in the world. We have to seek some other resolution to settle it down. Keeping our society healthy economically and emotionally for people. Science can contribute to these issues so much, including economics, historiography, and philosophy. I hope, although the government need to understand what scientists say and take it as their actions. If we take this in the big pictures, we can see the COVID-19 as a part of a social crisis, including natural disasters. In Japan, we had a big earthquake, 3/11, almost 10 years ago. The system created by the reconstruction of 3/11 is now useful for infectious disease control. Asia is a region with many past such experiences and disasters such as earthquakes and tsunami. Similar disasters happen around the world. It is a good timing to have discussion on science for society and international cooperation for global crisis response. Today, we invite 4 panelists and 4 commentators from Europe, Africa, the United States, Asia, and from Japan. So I would like to go to the speech sessions. The first speaker is Mr. Dan Dutour. He was appointed as Deputy Director General responsible for the portfolio international cooperation and resources in South Africa in 2004. Over the years, he has contributed to South Africa's diverse and prosperous international partnership initiative for STI. Dan, could you start your presentation? Dan, can you hear me? Could you check your mic? Mute?
Hear me now?
Okay, yeah. Please start.
Okay. Yes, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone. First of all, our deep appreciation to JST and the organizers of the Science Agora for inviting South Africa to participate in this session. We have a long-standing, much appreciated science partnership with Japan, and one of the highlights of that collaboration is our relationships with JST and Agora, which we've always valued as one of the world's leading platforms for interrogating the role science should play in society and promoting that role. So at this critical time, when our world is faced with this, in many instances, unique global challenge, which is COVID-19. And as you said, Miyoko, we need international cooperation, the sharing of experience and expertise more than ever. We welcome this opportunity with the distinguished colleagues from different regions and different countries to discuss on what we can learn on how best to mobilize and harness the capabilities of science, our respective scientific communities, to not only respond to pandemics such as COVID-19, but also to prepare for future pandemics. So I just want to start by just setting the scene very briefly. I mean, South Africa has been, in terms of absolute figures, the African country hardest hit by the pandemic. As I speak to you, out of a population of 58 million, we've had more than 700,000 cases. Most, of course, we've been fortunate to have seen recovery and a death rate of just over 20,000. Currently, after a very, very strict measures imposed by our government, we've had a hard lockdown for some time. The figures are evolving in a positive way, but as our president emphasized in his address to the nation just last week, and as experience has shown elsewhere in the world, we have to remain vigilant. There are still many, many uncertainties ahead of us. But I think perhaps the point to emphasize that other than the impact on public health and the very tragic loss of human health across the world, in South Africa, like elsewhere, the socioeconomic impact has also been devastating. As a country, we have continued to grapple with what we refer to as our triple challenge of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And of course, the impact of COVID-19, which has significantly adversely affected our economic growth, will only make that worse, to put it bluntly. We are currently struggling with unemployment figures of close to 30%, and within this economic environment, it will be very difficult to create a type of economic growth, to create new employment opportunities. And I think that's a very important point I wanted to emphasize at the outset, that when we look at natural disasters, whether public health, whether the environment, we have to see them within their socioeconomic context. And also the science response must be contextualized in that socioeconomic context. In terms of other disasters, because you had asked that we don't only reflect on COVID-19, South Africa, like many, many African countries, we experience climate change on a day-to-day basis as a reality. Currently, many parts of our country are suffering severe droughts, which will have impact on our ability to ensure food security, or of course flooding as well. And then also, as a country where the mining sector is very important, we often have to deal with seismic incidents. So the context in how we respond to disaster management is that we have national legislation, which has been in existence for some time, a dedicated National Disaster Management Act, which has been very useful in responding to COVID-19, and that legislation also allows and draws on the best scientific advice possible. And we think that's very important to ensure that you have that institutional framework. And that is all coordinated by a National Disaster Management Center, which has been in existence for some time. So in South Africa, science has really, like elsewhere in the world, been at the heart of the COVID-19 response. Right at the outset, our president assembled around him what I would like to call the very best of South African science. So these were dedicated advisory mechanisms and structures created, drawing on scientific expertise from all disciplines, not only from the infectious diseases, to ensure that our government can draw on the best scientific advice possible to inform our policy and decision making. It was not only the advice, but also the other capacities existing within the science system, specifically our research infrastructure, such as our National Center for Epidemiological Modeling or Analysis. And we have seen during this time that our investments over many years in dedicated capacity and infrastructure for data analysis, including high-speed networks, supercomputing, and data science experts, have been extremely useful. So the South African science system, one of our policy objectives have always been that we organize the science system to be well positioned to respond to disasters as they are emerged. So, for example, our department, one of the entities of our department is responsible for maintaining what we call the South African Risk and Vulnerability Atlas. This is a comprehensive set of climate and other data sets which point to those areas of South African society which is vulnerable specifically to natural disasters. And then our Academy of Science of South Africa has a range of experts groups which are available to advise government on disasters. And that is complemented by different capabilities which exist, for example, in our South African National Space Agency for geospatial data and analysis, and indeed ongoing research. It's very important that these existing capacities, including the institutional and legislative frameworks, continue to be the subject of critical research and analysis. And at one of our leading research universities, the Northwest University, we, for example, have a dedicated African Disaster Research Center, whose focus is critical academic analysis on how we should prepare and respond to disasters. So then to conclude, just to share with you from a science ministry, a government perspective, what are some of the lessons I could say we have taken from this time on how our science community has responded to COVID-19? Well, first of all, I wanted to say that this has been almost perversely, in the light of a huge public crisis, pandemic, and economic consequences, a good time for science in the public eye. We have never before had so much attention from the general public on science, with our leading scientists often appearing in mainstream media, etc. So that has created very much an opportunity for us to emphasize, and very much like the Science Agora and JST is doing, the importance of science in society. And then the second generic comment I would make is that we are still learning. So it's perhaps even too early to draw definitive conclusions, because this crisis, pandemic, is evolving. We've had very positive signs about news about vaccine development. But of course, till the time since that vaccine becomes available, specifically in developing countries in Africa, in an equitable and affordable manner, which will make a difference, there's still a lot which must happen. So we're very much still in the learning mode. I think what has been very important for us is it's highlighted the ability or the need to continue to draw on our existing experiences. South Africa has carried a massive disease burden in infectious diseases, notably HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis, for many years now. And that experience in successfully managing those diseases have been very important. We've drawn on those experts to inform our response to COVID-19. Like in most things, the data is absolutely key. And our ability to collect, analyze, and then develop policy advisory products is a critical investment area. I mean, COVID-19 has demonstrated that. But we very early were tasked by our president to create a national COVID-19 data response center at our Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. And I think one of the lessons here has been very clear to us that we need to enhance this data capabilities. I think another generic lesson is that we have been able to draw on the success of science investments we've made over many years in a whole range of disciplines. And that rather science capabilities. And that capabilities we were able to mobilize to respond in a very agile and dynamic manner to the challenges of COVID-19. And that we have to continue to do. So just to give you an example, I mean, all the data science investments we did for astronomy has proved very useful in supporting our modeling capability for COVID-19. At a very practical level, some of our engineers in our aerospace program were responsible for our national ventilator development program. So that was almost an indication of the merit of investing in scientific excellence, in engineering excellence. So that we continue then have to harness the best of scientific advice to improve our preparedness and management system. I'm sure countries all across the world will have these lessons. And then in terms of management in scientific advice, also coordination between different tiers of government. So in South Africa, we have a national government, we have provincial government, we have to have local government, and you need to have a coordinated response, but also the scientific advice, which feeds into those different levels of government, because they sometimes have different advisory systems, have to be coordinated and to be aligned. International cooperation is absolutely crucial. I mean, you said that, Miyoko, it's about the sharing of experience and expertise, of data, about access to research infrastructure, about making joint investments. And this time has really proven that. I mean, South Africa currently chairs the African Union, and for our president, it was very important to lead and ensure that African coordination. Very important, and we'll talk about this later, is communication with the public. Including through mainstream media. I mean, as I've said, this was a time where science was very visible in the public eye, and that the public wanted to trust and believe in the science. But of course, science is also uncertain because we keep on learning. So that communication, in order to maintain the public trust and confidence, also needed to ensure that the very nature of the scientific enterprise kept on being explained to the public, that scientists don't know always everything. And sometimes we need to change our views, that some things work and that don't work. And of course, that's difficult for the public, which wants certainty. I've said before that the social science has been absolutely critical. Our National Human Sciences Research Council had been tasked with and continues to do comprehensive understandings and analysis and surveys to understand our public's reaction and our understanding of COVID-19. Because as a government, we'll only be able to implement effective policies and response strategies if that is informed by a social science-based understanding of how society will react to these interventions. And we have to include all dimensions, and very specifically the gender dimension. South Africa carries a burden of what we're not proud of at all, of significant incidences, for example, of gender-based violence. The whole implementation of COVID-19 response measures increased that impact of gender-based violence. So these are all the societal aspects which we need our social scientists to inform our government on how to shape response strategies. And I think that's the last concluding point, is that we have to draw the best scientific advice possible from all disciplines, but that advice should also be underpinned by the values. In the South African context, that would be the values which espouses our constitution, specifically solidarity and ensuring social justice. We cannot exclude that domain from the science response. And then on a lighter note, just to emphasize that it's really all about stronger together. About a year ago, South Africa we were proud to be crowned in Japan world champions in rugby, and the motto for our campaign, for our team, was that we are stronger together. And I think to end where I started, that's why we welcome the organization of this session, because for our world to defeat COVID-19 and other challenges, we need to be united, because we can be stronger together. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dan. You clearly showed what is important for COVID-19 response. Data, international cooperation, public communication, social science, and gender dimensions are crucial for this crisis. Thank you very much. So next, the second speaker is Mr. Koji Saeki, next to me. He is a senior vice president of JST since July last year. He is in charge of almost all of the important issues and programs at JST. He is also responsible for this Science Agora now. So please start your presentation.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kosaiki, and first of all, let me express my heartfelt gratitude to excellent speakers from around the world for joining in this session today. I also would like to thank all the people online for your participation. Before starting my talk, I would like to express my sincere condolences to those who have passed away and sympathy for those who are still suffering from the effects of the pandemic. In my presentation, I would like to talk about these three points. My talk is based on lessons learned from JST activities concerning past disasters and COVID-19 pandemic. But it is individual opinion and not always represent the official view of JST. First, I would like to touch upon the impact of COVID-19. There is still no sign of the end of the pandemic, and Japan is now considered to be in the midst of the third wave. However, the impact of COVID-19 has still remained relatively small in Asia, including Japan, until now. As to Japan, the U.S. diplomatic journal Foreign Policy described the relatively quiet situation as a mysterious success, since the government has not enforced mandatory policies. Central and local governments have only requested certain measures to companies, shops, general publics, and so on. Several factors have been pointed out while not confirmed yet. For example, smaller number of PCR tests, differences in virus strains, genetic background, Japan's culture of strong hygiene awareness, the role of policy, and the well-established healthcare system, and so on. More detailed analysis is needed to decide what kind of factors really played important roles to realize Japan's situation. Now, I'd like to move to the next topics: STI and SR's role and JST's effort. We at JST are now working together with researchers to overcome this crisis. This is a draft chart of necessary science and technology elements prepared by Center for R&D Strategy in JST. There are multiple categories and groups about urgent tasks. There is no question that we need development of vaccines, drugs, and other medical technologies to deal with COVID-19. This is upper part of the chart, and another funding agency, EMED, is responsible for that. However, it is also important to accelerate R&D to maintain safe and secure social and economic activities in the society with COVID-19, which we call Plan B. The key words are detect, clean, and protect. JST will support such R&D initiatives by providing prompt funding through various schemes. As to the effective funding to fight such a crisis as COVID-19, we have learned through the past disaster, especially the Great East Japan earthquakes in 2011. The situation was really severe at that time, and JST initiated a new program called J-Rapid, aiming at promotion of international joint researches on problems caused by the disaster. And during time of disaster, we can benefit from the capabilities and experiences of other countries through international cooperation. In the case of global crisis, we can work together, combining our expertise, sometimes complementing each other. Joint activities were conducted under this funding with Thailand, Philippines, Nepal, and Indonesia, as stated in the right-hand side. JST has activated the program this time for research contributing to COVID-19 countermeasures. Also, JST is providing urgent support for researches related to the COVID-19 pandemic by launching flash courses under our flagship basic research programs. Also, the science and technology and innovation can play an important role for the recovery from disaster. JC has supported reconstruction of regional industry and revitalization of the economy through industry academic collaboration program. Now I'd like to move to the third part, ensuring the well-being of humankind. I would like to stress the importance of the concept Science for Global Well-being, the first pillar of the declaration adopted at the World Science Forum in October 2019. Now, when the survival of human society is at risk, it is necessary to promote science and technology for people's well-being. In addition, we must not forget the no one will be left behind pillar of the SDGs. For those purposes, I suppose three policy directions are important. To assist people to choose the appropriate actions and behavior, we should use science and technology to empower citizens. And maybe it is a good way to avoid totalitarian regime with full of surveillance. And we should review our social system and change that into more resilient one. That is quite there. The social researchers in social sciences really play an important role, as Dan pointed out. Also, against a crisis like COVID-19, we really need international collaboration leading to global solidarity. As to that, the prompt and open provision of convergent knowledge of the crisis is very important. This can establish the trust between citizens, policymakers, and scientists, and can encourage people's decision and behavior changes. Also, as to the trust, I'd like to point out three principles we should bear in mind. One is transparency, and second is fairness, and third is inclusive. Those kind of attitude may lead to more deep trust among the stakeholders. As to that, I'd like to show you a good case, a good example done by the high school students. Just after the earthquake in 2011, the Fukushima, because of the nuclear accident, it suffered from reputational damages. With technical support of JST, those high school students checked actual radiation level in various areas in Fukushima, and they compared it with other colleagues around Japan and around the world. They showed that there was no significant differences in radiation levels compared to other areas based on the scientific evidence. So, this is just one example, but to collaborate among various people, especially general public, we can foster the trust among us and lead to a more resilient society against this kind of pandemic or natural disasters. Okay. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Saki-san. You showed concrete plan of science and technology that is JST's Plan B. It is a different contribution from medical science. And you also mentioned trust is quite important to change our society and for COVID-19 response. Thank you very much. So next speaker is Dr. Jamila Mahmood. She is a special advisor to the Prime Minister of Malaysia on public health. She began her mandate in April this year. She is also a member of the government of Malaysia's Economic Action Council and is actively engaged in the COVID-19 response. Jamila, please start your speech within 10 minutes. Please.
Konnichiwa. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be invited to share some of our experiences from Malaysia. And congratulations to Science Agora 2020 for bringing together such esteemed speakers. I've really enjoyed listening to the two previous speakers, and there's not very much that I want to add to that, but maybe share the Malaysian perspective of things. Malaysia is one of those countries that does not, fortunately, suffer from earthquakes, but we are feeling the brunt of climate change, and flooding is one of the biggest problems we have in the country. So COVID-19 came to us late last year in December, but only manifested in larger numbers around March. And the whole scientific community, particularly the health community, has really led the response. You know, all the things that were said earlier about trust being such an important factor in the management of a pandemic, and that it's people and their behaviors that will determine the outcome of this pandemic I just want to overemphasize that. As a Ministry of Health came together, we had the benefit of previous experiences of SARS, MERS-CoV, H1N1, and therefore we didn't start from scratch. And this is where I think the science community is a learning community. And I completely agree with the first speaker, Mr. Dan Dutoit, that we have to be humble that there's not everything that we know, and there are things we know that change very quickly overnight with COVID-19. So one of the things that we did was to ensure that there would be faces of trust. And just as mentioned by our South African speaker, it was to identify someone who would build trust quickly with the public. And this was the Director General of Health. And he would come onto the television every day at 5 p.m. with millions, literally half the population of Malaysia, glued to the television to listen to the data. And to build that trust, data has to be verified and it has to be transparent. And therefore, this Director General shared data on a daily basis, the number of cases, number of tests, and all the other data that's important. Public health measures are extremely important in managing a pandemic. And simple messaging, the simplicity of messaging is also very crucial. For countries like Japan, social discipline is very high, and it's very much easier to try to send messages on physical distancing, wearing a mask. But you and I know at the end of the day, social behaviors alter the way we take these messages. And, you have congregations, social activities that just throw everything out the window. So I think this has been the crux of how we've dealt with this. Added to that, of course, is bringing the other scientific communities around the table, those from the Academy of Professors, those from National Institutes of Health, behavioral scientists, to really look at how we use their expertise to augment the response and the recovery. Technology has played a major role in this pandemic, and our Ministry of Science and Technology, together with our National Security, Ministry of Health, has really come together to build, applications where tracking, tracing is very, very crucial in the management. And right now, what we're doing is building in behavioral risk assessments into even those applications, so that anyone using it will be able to will calculate their own personal risk when they go out of the house, or when they do a certain activity, or when they go to a certain location. So I will reiterate that it is a learning process. The other thing I want to emphasize is that the pandemic is not just a health crisis. It's a health crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis, it's a development crisis, it's a financial crisis. And therefore, bringing in the economic ministries, the economic advisors, the economists, the actuaries, the financial experts to look at solutions for this. And one of the things that has come out of this is really looking at innovative financing mechanisms that would actually support the recovery from the pandemic. We now know that a vaccine is close to being produced. We are still looking for the hard data on its safety. I think that it's very strange how two things I learned from the vaccine experience. One is that when scientists collaborate, you get results fast. And I think this has been a very important learning. It's international cooperation, it's big pharma cooperating, and therefore being able to shorten the time to produce a vaccine from its normal 10 years to about 1 year and a bit. So collaboration is very, very important. But the second thing I learned is that pharma now tells you of their success on media and not through the research. And this is quite alarming, because we as scientists have not read the results of the phase 3, but the world at large has heard that it's 90% or 95% effective. And I think this is where marketing comes before science, and it's a reality that we have to accept in this day and age. The other thing that I would say is that one of the areas I am really struggling, in my country at least, to get much more research and much more action on is mental health. Mental health in many countries like mine is still quite stigmatized. And we're really pushing the mental health experts now to really come up with the data, with the evidence, and to guide the ministries of health as well as the public on dealing with this mental health crisis, which I think we're just scratching the surface. And I think international cooperation in this is very, very high. I also want to say, I mentioned earlier that we have a flooding risk, and we're actually entering into our flood season right now as the rains get very heavy towards the end of the year. And now we need the people who manage these natural hazards leading to disasters to work with health experts to figure out how will you manage the placement of people who are displaced from the floods and not putting them at greater risk of COVID-19 transmission. So it requires a completely different paradigm in looking at the problem and really finding a holistic solution to it all. So I think in summary, I would say that COVID-19 has been a big eye-opener for us. And for many years, let's be honest, that many different actors work in silos, whether you're a humanitarian or someone in disaster risk reduction or in climate change adaptation or in health. Everyone works in their own silos. And this has been a real eye-opener that we need to start looking at things in a bigger picture, how the different aspects of science connect, and how in connecting we actually find solutions that are not just fast, but also robust. They are sustainable and they are interoperable. So I want to thank the Japanese government for organizing this. And I want to call upon all of you to, let's work together. Let's share these experiences. Let's connect and let's learn from each other. And thank you once again.
Thank you, Jamila. I hope we keep our connection more. And anyway, you gave us a good suggestion as an advisor to the Prime Minister. Or you showed hint of how to obtain trust from government and public. And you said international collaboration is crucial to obtain the trust. Thank you very much. So last presenter is Dr. Anne Cambon-Thomsen. She is a French medical doctor specialized in human immunogenetics and health ethics. She is now Emeritus Research Director at French National Center for Scientific Research. She is also ambassador of the Research Data Alliance, RDA, for health science and research ethics. Please start your presentation.
Thank you very much. Hello to all, and thank you very much for allowing me to come in this panel and share some of the experience from this COVID-19 crisis. I will have 3 points. One at the national level, France is my country, one at the European level, and one at the international aspects of this of facing this COVID crisis. The first thing is France, 67 million inhabitants, is heavily hit and is currently in the second wave, which is a serious one. So we have, in total, we have had 47,000 deaths due to COVID-19 and 68% being in hospitals. I don't want to give too many numbers, just serious as other countries in Europe, like Belgium, Italy, Spain, UK, for example. We actually had 2 periods of lockdown. One is still going on. One was in around nearly 2 months, in 55 days precisely, in March, from mid-March to 11th of May. And then a period of, different measures. And the second wave started in September and was at its peak in November. So we actually are in lockdown until 1st of December, but the modalities have evolved. So between the first spring lockdown and the autumn one, there has been lessons learned and consequences of lockdown taken into account. And I was thinking of children, for example, not being at school in spring and being at school now. So the priority to education, for example. We have had in France the nomination of 2 science advice mechanism committees ad hoc for COVID-19. One is a scientific committee that helps managing the crisis on a day-by-day basis, I would say. And it was created the 11th of March and is still very active, has produced a number of notes and opinions, about 30, on different questions. The other committee is called CARE. It's a committee for the analysis, research, and expertise. And it's more oriented on the orientation and the advice for science, for research in this period. It was created the 24th of March. So within 2 weeks, there have been 2 new specific committees that, of course, do not replace the existing mechanisms, but show how important was this aspect of science advice. Now, I would like to come to the second point of this short talk, which is at the European level. I am a member of the European Group on Ethics of Science and New Technologies that advise for ethical aspects to be taken into account in European Union policies, advice to the European Commission. And there is also a science advice mechanism constituted by a group of a dozen of scientists of different disciplines that are chief scientific advisors to the European Commission. These two groups work sometimes on related topics, but in this crisis, the European Group on Ethics, in the middle of another opinion, which is still going on genome editing, made a statement on European solidarity and protection of fundamental rights. So the values that were underlined by the previous speakers were brought to the forefront through this statement. And that was in early April. In June, recently in November, and another one is planned in 2021, the scientific advisors and the European Group on Ethics, together with the special advisor to the President of the European Commission, worked together on topics related to COVID-19. And the statement that appeared in June is on scientific advice to European policymakers during the COVID-19 crisis, also showing the lessons learned on this aspect of science advice and the values behind the science advice. The recent November opinion is actually on improving, so turned to the future, improving pandemic preparedness and management at the European level. Because we saw in the first phases of the crisis that to react as Europeans, not only as countries, was maybe not on its best organization for this health crisis. So there are a number of both fundamental values and lessons learned and recommendation on this topic. And the third aspect that will be worked on now and in the beginning of 2021 is actually how to be more resilient in future crises, be there epidemics or other kind of crisis. So this is just to show that at European level, there has been this, for the first time, work together between science advice and ethical committee. The third point of my talk is at international level. You heard that I am an ambassador of the Research Data Alliance, which is an international organization that started in 2013, so not too ancient. The European Commission, among other, asked in mid-March this organization to set up a working group to advise both policymakers and researchers on the ground and data managers on the data sharing in time of pandemic, and specifically this COVID-19 pandemic. So I was one of the co-chairs of this group, and which is still working on some aspects. And in less than a week, more than 600 people from all over the world, different countries, Europe, Asia, Africa, and America. And also we had people from Australia, came together and to help with this, using their expertise to set up or make more visible standards in different ways. And the topic I want to underline is this interdisciplinarity, because the pandemic, and the previous speakers have said it, has many aspects: the health, the care, the epidemiology. There was also a group corresponding to social science, and then in cross-cutting themes had specific groups working on, like the ethical and legal aspect, which are so important in sharing data across frontiers. Equally, a group worked on software, because it's not only data, it's software to manage the data that are needed to be shared. So I don't want to take too long. The document has been produced within 2 months or 2 months and a half. There was 5 releases of a document which was finalized and endorsed by the Research Data Organization and made completely public and disseminated the 30th of June. So from end of March to end of June, there was an incredible work of all these people. I've never seen so many group meetings, such an efficient coordination. So in itself, this is an experience which from the people in RDA was very special at the time of this COVID-19. And using all these different expertise, cross-disciplinary, to help making recommendations for policymakers and for researchers in practice, how to share and what to refer as standards and where to find the rules and so on, to share data efficiently. I think this is a sort of milestone at this International of Science mobilization. So that's the 3 points I wanted to make, and of course I can intervene in the discussion on the points you would like to. Thank you very much again for this opportunity. And hello from France.
Thank you. You experienced a severe pandemic in France, and you show the concrete action of European science community, and that is what we have to know. And you said data sharing in time. That is very important. Thank you very much. So we had a presentation from 4 panelists. They showed some common suggestions for COVID-19 response. The first is we need international collaboration, including data sharing. The second is the pandemic is one of the disasters, like climate change-induced natural disaster. And the third is we need trust to respond to COVID-19 and the social crisis. So here, let me share the figures showing the current COVID-19 number of the infected people and deaths in countries of speakers in this session. The numbers shows each case over 1 million population. As you know, the US, Europe, and South Africa shows a higher number, and Asia shows lower numbers. Uganda also shows very small numbers. The situation strongly depends on the area and the country. So we have common issues and local issues, both. So I'd like to take comment on these suggestions from 4 commentators from various countries. The first is Dr. Connie Ushimari. Connie, I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce your family name. Anyway, she's an immediate past co-chair of the Global Young Academy. She's an independent science and policy facilitator and acts at the Science Policy Interface as a science writer, trainer, and speaker. She's also current Secretary General of the Uganda National Young Academy. She can talk why Uganda shows small number of infections and deaths. Anyway, she's a representative of young people and African people. Connie, please start your comment.
Yes. Good evening over there in Japan. It's just afternoon here. I'm happy to be here, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It has been very interesting, as you say, to listen to how the pandemic has affected the different regions of the world, and of course we see it here listening to the news. And it must be said that I do see some similarities with my own country. with that said, as you correctly said, the nature of the pandemic as experienced by the Ugandan public differs from everyone who has spoken. We actually reported our first death towards the end of July, so months and months after the pandemic was already raging around the world. And 4 months later, we are only at around just under 160 deaths. So, I mean, there are days that we don't record any deaths at all still. And it's certainly possible that part of what we observe is just a poor data collection. But it's similar to what has happened in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. My reading so far has not really brought a very strong reason why this is the case. So this is still a case for research. And maybe some of the panelists know something that I don't, because after all, I'm not a COVID expert. But what this has created anyway for us is that there's been a relaxation of vigilance, because we had something like a 3 or 4 month lockdown where we were very vigilant and we were observing social distance, and this was very strong. But now, when you go around the cities, people are just walking around without masks in very crowded areas, so the vigilance has dropped. And with regard to communication, national science communication, this is, as it was said for South Africa, largely through the president. So the president holds these public addresses every so often, and he has taken a very big lead in communicating with the public, apparently informed by a team of scientists. The only difference with South Africa, for instance, is that this team of scientists is largely from the medical sciences. So hardly any social sciences enters that equation. So the social and economic effects have only been realized after the lockdown has ended. And I must say that even then, when you look at the research funding that's being released, even then, social and economic issues are still very low on the radar. So I don't really see planning for resilience or wider thinking about the epidemic beyond how is the disease spreading, how can we track it better, and these kind of things. And again, maybe that's just how it is here in Uganda. Perhaps we don't have such a strong interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary research culture yet. And as with Malaysia, there's also a big concern over mental health. We have seen more and more public displays of people setting themselves on fire. Certainly domestic violence has spiked, a lot of teenage pregnancies. So a lot of social issues are being observed, but you don't see a lot of focus on it in the science communication to the public. And peculiar about Uganda is also that we are in the months preceding our parliamentary and presidential elections. So unfortunately, the pandemic control has become a little bit politicized. If some of you have seen in the news in the last 2 days, the main opposition candidate has been locked up because he apparently held a rally with the number of people more than what is allowed, although the ruling party holds as big a rally as they like and nothing happens. But the riots also could be a response, just a frustration of the economic and social effects of this pandemic, because in the cities, there's a lot of informal economic activity, and this has faced a lot of strain during the lockdown, which was 3 or 4 months long, and this still hasn't recovered. So in summary, I would just say that the direct communication between scientists and the public has been very low, and the main communication is still through the health ministry machinery. And it doesn't seem that we are making any steps towards doing research into how we can become more resilient as a society. And it could be that we already feel quite resilient, because you may know that Ebola is something that we've fought several times over the last so many years. And it could be that we already feel fairly resilient. So the coronavirus or the COVID-19 pandemic appears to be quite low on the long list of troubles that we have as a society. And instead, government now faces pressure to reopen schools, to allow churches to reopen, and the scientific advice really doesn't play a big role in those decisions. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Connie. One reason why the number of the infected people in Uganda is the pandemic started late, so we should know each local conditions. And you are aware of a social problem induced by COVID-19, and you are contributing with science communication with the public and many people. Thank you very much. So next, I'd like to ask the comment to Professor David Boots Pedersen. He is a professor of science communication and the director of the Humanomics Research Center at Aalborg University in Copenhagen. He will join Kyoto University International Advisory Board for the L-Insight Global Excellence Program from next year. So maybe we can see next year. So David, please start your comment.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And good afternoon to everyone. And I would also like to start expressing my gratitude to the JST and Science Agora for organizing this international panel. It's already been a pleasure and very inspirational to listen to colleagues from around the world who are definitely doing a huge difference in coming up with a resilient response to the current pandemic, which we are all facing. I really believe that the pandemic we're witnessing is such a cross-cutting event that all disciplines and across all silos, may they be civil society, policymaking, or science, needs to come together and work together. And I think this has been stressed throughout the session. So I'm going to speak a little bit to you from the point of view of being an exotic social scientist who actually does research on the COVID-19 science advice response. So I've been looking into how science advisors around Europe, with a particular focus on Denmark and the Nordic countries, are responding to the current crisis. And I will be speaking a little bit about the need for stressing independent expert advice and evidence. What we have seen from the standpoint of doing research is at least that in the Nordic countries, Scandinavia, governments have been relying very heavily on their internal services and agencies, or as Connie said, the machinery of the health ministry. Cross-government coordination and integration has been working very well throughout the first wave of the pandemic in the spring, but has turned out to be much more contested and less trustworthy during the second wave. So in the first wave, we saw very little to none party politicization or polarization regarding crisis. There was a large degree of consensus across all parties and also across civil society, with compliance rates up to 90% of the population would follow and report following government recommendations, behavioral recommendations, and would listen to government communication and find it trustworthy. Whereas during the last phase of the pandemic, and rapidly actually accelerating during the last couple of weeks only, we have been witnessing an increasing polarization on restrictions such as wearing masks, social distancing, closing of restaurants, closing of businesses. And we do know that such polarization in the opinions and the attitudes towards the pandemic do have effects on compliance. And actually in our data right now, we can see that there is a slight fall in compliance. So the fact that people start doubting what government scientists are saying is really a testimony also to the fact that compliance may go down. So in reality, we have witnessed a system-wide failure of independent science advice. I think we have been too reliant on the government's own advisors that, as many of you will know, are often filtrated through the political system, where messages are going to get designed for political audience rather to a scientific one. So there has been a manifest lack of power distance in the Scandinavian countries between science and policy, which has led to this general feeling that policymakers are quite selective in their use of evidence. And several position statements published by science advisory bodies and panels have actually been neglected. So we have seen advice on recommendations to not closing borders, to not closing public schools. And also we have seen the failure of not acknowledging very early warnings already in the spring of some mutations within our mink population. Also, at the same time, we have worked continuously to get access to open data, to cross-check the advice coming from government by independent laboratories. And I think some success have been made. So I'll end my short intervention here to say that in the Scandinavian countries, we have had for now a number of years, but actually culminating in the pandemic, a very high level of trust to both government and scientists, but it is slightly decreasing. And I think exactly transparency, fairness, inclusiveness, and then also openness and independence is some of the keywords that we need to focus more on moving ahead forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You mentioned the lack of independent expert advice and evidence, or there has been a lack of power distance between science and policy. And you said several statements by science advisors has been neglected. It is a shock, but maybe it's a common issue in the world. We have tackle and we have to solve this problem, this big gap. Thank you very much. So next commentator is Professor Yasuo Deguchi. He is a vice provost and a professor of philosophy, Kyoto University. David will visit next year. He is one of the most successful and popular philosophers in Japan. His theory is very original and based on Asia perspective. A lot of academia and company people are interested in his theory. He will talk from Japanese philosophy perspective. Please start, Deguchi-sensei.
So can I share my slide with you?
Yes.
Yes, okay, I will do that. Thank you. Here is a slide. So my comments are, of course, very, very, very philosophical. Be careful about that. Okay, and let me ask what is the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. That is one of the main issues today, I think. And I prepare lesson 3, okay, 3 lessons. And here's lesson 1. First one, that is incapabilities. So we observed many levels of sorts of incapabilities, individuals, local communities, government, even science, and health sectors, and human beings, at least in the end. And of course, we should remove or improve those incapability by many means as possible, and including those you mentioned already. We should do that. But I wonder that there is or remains at least one fundamental incapability for all humans after those all efforts. That is the fact that we cannot live our lives, even one day life, without helps, support, or afford, or many other agents, such as fellow human beings, non-humans, social infrastructures, institutions, science, and ecosystem, global ecosystem, and geosystem. So as far as some of the observing incapabilities of many levels come from this fundamental incapability of all humans, that is inescapable. That is quite bad news, I'm afraid. But there is a good news, good sign on the other side of the coin, that is being supported affordedness. Since, as I said, we are fundamentally incapable or weak, we should be, and actually is, helped, supported, afforded by those various numerous agents as far as we are alive, as far as our life is continued. So being supportedness or affordedness is our nature or given or essence that we cannot get rid of. That's good news. And this is a last lesson I want to mention today. So global or local cooperation at many level is not merely an ideal that we should aim at, but a default or starting point or given that we should keep track of and that we should avoid or reduce our derailment from it. So, but certainly there are many derailment we are observing globally, locally from these default cooperations. But I believe that when we observe from the pandemic phenomena, for example, our fundamental incapabilities and basic mutual support, and when we dispel our illusion that we can live our life by us alone, maybe we can lead to a guide to derailment to this default cooperation. A cooperation is default. We should restore that. That is a lesson we can learn from corona pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Or maybe many people are interested in what you said because you mentioned we should focus on incapability. Usually, we talk about the capability of humans, but you said incapability is more important, so that we need collaboration, cooperation. So thank you very much. So final commentator is Julia McKenzie in SSS in the United States. She is the Chief Program Officer of SSS. She was promoted to this position at the beginning of this month. Congratulations, Julia. She is an expert in science policy and global health diplomacy. She is now in the United States and about 4 o'clock in the morning. It is too early for her to join this session. So we got her message for this session. So I read her message for her. SSS congratulate JST on Science Agora. We wish we could be together with you in person, but trust that we will soon be together again. It is more important than ever to ensure that science is serving society. The COVID pandemic has promoted scientific discovery at awesome speed, producing effective vaccine against a novel pathogen faster than was ever imagined, and simultaneously has revealed immense challenges at the interface of science, policy, and disaster response implementation. In the face of these challenges, scientists must 3 things. First is communicate more efficiently, including communicating risk and uncertainty with policymakers, journalists, and directly with the public. Second is strengthen local engagement between scientists and communities so that relationships of trust are built in advance of next crisis. And third is work to build more robust system of international collaboration in the face of global challenge, such as the emerging disaster and climate change. The long-standing partner of Science Agora, we wish you a productive meeting and look forward to working together. Best wishes, Julia. Thank you very much, Julia. So we would like to start our discussion, but we only have 15 minutes, so we have to very fruitful discussion for the short time. So first discussion is, maybe we can discuss only for this topic. What is the role of a scientist in scientific advice in crisis and how to work with government? So David told us there has been a big gap between science and policy. And first of all, I would like to ask Jamia, you are a special advisor to the Prime Minister and the medical doctor. Could you give us a comment about it?
Yep. Thank you very much. I was listening with a lot of interest on Prof. Peterson's comments. My role is actually, I'm a long-standing humanitarian and development actor, and was appointed to this position merely because I escaped COVID in Switzerland, came home for a break, and was just hired. So I would disagree, because I think in Malaysia, at least, our perspective is the scientist community is very independent. The Ministry of Health is extremely independent. And in fact, every day we meet interministerial meetings, sometimes chaired by the Prime Minister, where the last say will be the scientific community. So politicians take instruction from the scientists, which is actually I think it's good, because it's really important. My role as advisor is also very, very interesting, because I have a very neutral role where I can actually even check on the government to say, I don't agree with that, or I agree. So I think, this is extremely important in managing the pandemic, because if you politicize health, then we will really get into a lot of trouble. So I think in trying to, how do you ring fence then scientists to play that neutral role in advising government, and that requires the leadership to actually acknowledge that in a crisis like this, you do need evidence-based, fact-based decision-making, and not politicizing the crisis. The one other thing I will say is that in Malaysia, we have massive amount of netizens. We probably have one of the most robust social media countries in the world. And what happens is that everything that comes out has to be fact-checked by the Ministry of Health, because one of the biggest challenges with wanting to have transparency and wanting to have an ability to communicate is in an infodemic of also misinformation. So I think being able to nip misinformation in the bud very quickly by the scientific community is going to be crucial, and the actual laws when there's misinformation that people can be charged. So it's important. It has to be independent. We need to protect and ring fence the scientists, and the communications has also to be checked all the time.
Thank you. If you have a comment, please raise your hand. Do you have some comment about it? So may I ask Dan, you are working at the government side, so you should know how to these questions. Could you give us a short comment?
Yes, thank you. And I think the short comment will actually just be to agree with everything Jamila has just said from a government perspective, because that's the way it should be. We want our scientific community to, without fear or favor, and give us the best advice possible. That's their responsibility. As a government, our responsibility is then to make the best decisions in the interests of our citizens, drawing on all advice and contextualizing them in the socioeconomic reality we have. So it's all about trust, building that relationship of trust, and then being very clear of the respective roles and responsibilities, and avoiding, as Jamila said, the situation where parties antagonize each other, because it's really all about a common purpose.
Thank you, David.
But it does take maturity in a system, and that we should all acknowledge. And it will always be work in progress, and we should not take any of that for granted. So it's a set of relationships which we continuously have to invest in.
Thank you, Dan. David, please.
Yes, no, I appreciate the comments by Jamila and Dan. I do myself believe strongly in independent science advice, but it is just I'm just observing the fact that in the Scandinavian countries, I think for a number of years we believed we were so good at science advice that we actually mainstreamed all our advisors into government, which makes them part of government and therefore also seen not as the neutral or honest broker that Jamila was speaking about, but more as an vested interest, which is a very tricky position to be in. Still, the advice is sound. Still, the government is trustworthy. We have very little degree of corruption, actually none. We have very high degree of trust in government and normally also high levels of transparency. But I think the role of the independent advisor is extremely important to have, as Jamila also said, to put the government's own communication and conclusions under scrutiny and to get second opinions. It's actually a very valuable resource for democracy and for our societies to be able to access second opinions. There was a really nice paper put out by my colleagues, Sir Peter Gluckman and James Wilston, a couple of years back called The Paradox of Science Advice. And it's a little bit, what they are arguing is that if you're too close as an advisor to politics, that might sometimes compromise your independence. If you're too far away from policymaking, you might not really understand how to provide advice in a timely and responsive manner. So we have constantly to negotiate the distance between policy and science. And I think we are all learning how to become better at that.
Thank you very much. We have, okay, please.
Just on this point, I think that it has been said by others, the underlying uncertainty. And in times of a new disease, a new pandemic, there is a lot of uncertainty. And this leads to non-consensus, or at least debate, among scientists, and this has been true for clinical trials, and this has been true for the weight of different factors in the evolution of the pandemics. And what I saw in France was debate on the TV, for example, between scientists and the journalists. That's my own belief, should have a role there, the media, in trying to explain to the public why it is important to have these discrepancies and their basis, and that this is normal, and that's also part of the trust. But in many cases, what I saw was the desire of journalists to have these battles in front of the public because it attracts the public, rather than explaining the basis of this uncertainty, of these discrepancies, which is difficult. So there, I think that there is a role of scientists, but there is also the role in the interaction between scientists and media, and specifically in this time and evidence of uncertainty, if I can say so.
Okay, Connie, just a moment. We have a question from the audience. I would like to ask you to answer this question. Do you see any change of activity of scientists and government cooperation after COVID-19 pandemic? Can you answer, Connie?
Yes, of course. I think so. We've already seen a little more interest in what scientists produce. Although, as I said earlier, many of the scientists only produce advice from only one perspective. So they'll only do, the problem from one discipline. But yes, I think there will be more reliance or more acknowledgement of what science can do. But just to add to that, what Dan said about a system being mature is very, very important, because in our case, because the communication between government and scientists is not mature, then in a crisis, ineffective, because they don't, no time to build those communication. And so they rely on their usual system, which is through the line ministry. And then there's not that much research done in the ministries, so that in the end we end up acting on advice that concerns international situations. So we really had to rely a lot on what internationally is being suggested, rather than on data that is being produced in the country or advice that's being produced in the country.
Thank you very much. Degui-sensei, do you have any comment about it? Do you see some change?
Okay, well, no change. This is related to what I mentioned. And okay, scientific advice is, of course, evidence-based and fact-based, but that is also assumption-based. That is the case, especially for the model and simulations. In the pandemic, many scientists produced or provided us a simulation for pandemic, and that is based on many, many big assumptions. Some are good, some are unreliable. But still there's a gap between the science know that. So what we have is based on the many assumptions. But that is not the case for the policy makers and general public. Still there's sort of a recognition gap between this aspect of science that I think still problem remain.
Thank you very much. Saiki-san, do you have any comment?
Thank you for the chance, for giving me a chance to talk about that. I think I'd like to point out another aspect of the science-based advice and policy making. There's a kind of conflict between value, or, for example, this is a health crisis, but also this is financial and economic crisis. In Japan's case, people could be dead because of the soft control of the contact between among the general public. But also, if we put on quite a strict measure, then the economy will become quite down, and then especially in Japan's case, there must be a rise in suicide cases and so on. For example, in August, we have seen the 80% increase suicide among the young female generation. Of course, that is not only because of the economy, but that kind of conflict of the policy decision and consequences occurred. So policy decision making is not only couldn't be based only on the science basis, but there must be a consideration among the values of other aspects, or influence of the other consequence because of the decision made, the policy decided from the certain aspect. So it's really difficult topics, and the point is, important point is, as you mentioned, our colleagues mentioned the transparency and the some independence and so on. But still, there's a limitation of what science advice can do. So this is my point.
Thank you very much. So I would like to discuss more, but I have to close this session very soon. So finally, I would like to conclude this session. Everybody in any stakeholder in science community can contribute to the response of the social crisis, including COVID-19. We need our action now, accepting public needs, and key word is collaboration. We need local and international collaboration. That is essential and crucial. And trust is also crucial in our society. We would like to make more trust between scientists and the government and public people with many stakeholders. Thank you very much. I hope we will discuss more somewhere in the future. So finally, I would like to appreciate all of the panelists commentator, staffs, they prepared this session very hard. Thank you very much. And all of the participant audience of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.